With feet roughly parallel and about shoulder width apart, drive them into the floor to bring your hips up into full extension, keeping the tail tucked so that you have a long, straight spine throughout this movement, especially at hip extension. I don't want you arching your lower back to give yourself the illusion of more hip extension. That's the technique. Here are a couple notes about setup. The hip thrust is one of my favorite exercises for development of the posterior chain, so the glutes specifically and the hamstrings a little bit too. I love this exercise for two reasons. Number one reason is you can load it up with a ton of weight and there is virtually no risk of injury. Worst thing that's going to happen is you're just not going to be able to get all the way up in the hip extension. No big deal, just lighten it up. Number two, the reason is that it actually works the glutes into a full extension. So a deadlift right here, pretend I have the bar, is great for taxing the hamstrings, glutes, and the entire posterior chain when you're in hip flexion like this. But follow me now. As I lift the bar and get above the knees, now I'm really kind of more in line with gravity here. So the deadlift or the kettlebell swing doesn't really have much to offer in terms of development from this position with a little bit of hip flexion all the way to extension. That is where the hip thrust shines, because even though I'm a little bit limited in how much work I can get here in hip flexion, once I get up to this point, that's when this exercise is actually the hardest. So this is great for working the hips in full extension. One of the downsides of the hip thrust is that the setup can be a little bit daunting. So I have this BC Strength hip thrust setup from Brett Contreras. Just pulls out. You can put this thing in. If you don't have a hip thrust apparatus at your gym or at home, you can use a bench, or I've even used a low plyo box before. Now, you're going to pull the weight onto your hips first, and then try to get your shoulder blades above the edge of the bench, and then begin the exercise. But if you're a little shorter, and you can't get your shoulders above the bench, then what you can do is use a pad like this, or even a barbell plate stacked up to raise your hips a little bit higher. Now your shoulders are comfortably above the bench and you can begin hip thrusting. But what do you do if you can't get the barbell up onto your hips with enough room to get your knees up and feet flat into the starting position? Well, the solution to that is to put some barbell bumper plates down and then pull the barbell up onto the plates to create more height so that you can now bring the barbell onto your hips with your shoulders above whatever you're using as your posting mechanism, and then begin your set. And then when you're done, just roll it off and you're good to go. One more thing about hip thrusting. I highly recommend using some type of squat collar. This is one from Iron Bull that I got on Amazon for like $15. Totally worth it. Another solution is to use one of these balance pads and put that on your hips, though these are pretty thick and can kind of get annoying. It works in a jam. Worst case scenario, you can take a gym towel and wrap it around the bar